and block the water so they can't get back across onto the mainland. It's always a risk you take when you cross onto some kind of island or another position that it's mostly surrounded by water. But that did not happen. What we're going to see, the Americans are going to be able to get off.
The bad news, though, for this is for Rhode Islanders, that the British would remain another year in Newport before they returned to New York in 1779. And part of the reason that anger and passions continue to inflame as the war goes on between the two sides is if you take a territory, let's say that British are in Newport, they're going to occupy houses in a war where supply lines are stretched thin or sometimes non-existent. They're going to consume the supplies. Once you return to your home as a Rhode Islander, you might find that your livestock has been slaughtered, all the supplies in your home is gone, it's badly damaged. Things like the Third Amendment that we sort of chuckle at today about no forced quartering of troops, that the Army can't forcibly commandeer your supplies. There's memories of things like this happening in the Revolutionary War. And when your entire livelihood is consumed by the enemy, that's going to inflame the passion more. So this is not good news for Rhode Islanders when they can't go home for a year. So anyway, there's a lot of aftermath to look at after this battle. What's some other aspects of the aftermath?
Yeah, on August 30th, Sullivan received word that D'Estaing and his fleet would not be coming anytime soon. Thank you, D'Estaing. He also learned that Howe's fleet was on the move and seemed to be headed for Rhode Island. So that's not good. The British are coming and the French are not coming. And based on this information, Sullivan decided to evacuate the island, Aquidneck or Rhode Island. He covered the movement by ordering some men to set up tents and dig fortifications. This is psychological warfare, if you will, or psyops. They're faking out the British. The British will think that they're digging in, but it didn't work. The British knew, they were not confused. They knew what was going on. But nevertheless, by 3 a.m. the next day, this is August 31st, the Americans were off the island. So that's a good thing. The Americans didn't get trapped. They got away to fight another day. But again, they're, as you mentioned, Rhode Islanders, both civil and military, are very upset because they've spent how long? A year, 2 years trying to get Newport back, and it doesn't work. A fleet carrying 4,300 British reinforcements arrives on that same day, on the 31st of August, including General Clinton himself, and that settles who's going to hold Newport. Now, that brings you up to almost, let's see, what is that, 9,000? Probably with the casualties a little bit less, but Clinton got there. He criticized Piggott for letting the Americans get away. Piggott left Rhode Island and went to London in late September. So that's the end of him, at least in terms of his career. The failure of the American attempt to take Newport disappointed Washington and led to much casting around of blame. Most New Englanders blamed the French.
Yes, they did. And we mentioned this a little earlier where there were anti-French riots in Boston. But just to dig in a little bit deeper, the Americans are upset because the alliance with the French isn't bringing the immediate benefits that they thought it would. They think to themselves, if the French would have held up their end of the bargain, we could have won. And they don't see any French troops showing up to fight in America. Like I mentioned earlier, the first 2 years after the treaty is signed, most of the fighting is in the West Indies because the French is more concerned about their interests there. And Washington is trying to bring in the French, both their Navy and Army, to New York to capture the city and end the war. But it's not happening. He's frustrated. And in the immediate aftermath of Rhode Island, Sullivan was proud of the conduct of his army, but his officers were angry with the French. One of them, John Lawrence, he summarizes his views writing for a Charleston, South Carolina newspaper, and he writes, "The action of the 29th and our subsequent retreat have done honor to the American arms and consoled us in some degree for the cruel disappointment occasioned by the unexpected departure of the French squadron." And a Salem officer wrote also, "There never was a greater spirit seen in America for the expedition and greater disappointment when Mr. Frenchman left us." And so I love that, Mr. Frenchman. And New Englanders blame the French for the expedition's failure. And a British officer who's held captive in Connecticut, he writes about the shifting mood of ordinary soldiers who are passing through the town. And he said that departing for Rhode Island, these troops were very happy, very merry, and in jest. and they used to call the British lobsterbacks. But on their return, they skulked through the town and went unnoticed. But when they passed us, they asked if the island had been surrendered. The British asked them if the island had surrendered, and they shook their heads and they cursed the French for leaving them in a lurch. A Hessian prisoner who was held in Massachusetts wrote, "Everywhere I had gone, Rhode Island was the topic of conversation. Everyone wished the French ill. Some even cursed the whole alliance with France." So bad feelings with the French at this moment.
All right. Well, a couple more things. This is a quote from the Journal of the American Revolution's website regarding the Rhode Island campaign. It says, "This failed American campaign, often overlooked as insignificant, not only stopped military momentum gained from Saratoga and the recovery of Philadelphia, it showed that the alliance with France would not bring a speedy end to the war. The Northern Theater remained in a stalemate for the rest of the war." So, yeah, it kind of helps the Americans to realize that the French are not a magic bullet. You know, they're not just going to sweep in and just wipe out all the British and that'll be the end of it. They have their own agenda. It's not all about the Americans' plans. And as Scott touched upon earlier, the British eventually do just abandon Newport. They just give it up in October of 1779, but they leave behind an economy ruined by war. And here's a miscellaneous fun fact that I find interesting and significant. The Battle of Rhode Island was notable for the participation of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which consisted of blacks, Indians, and white colonists. It was a multiracial, integrated military unit, which we're not going to see in American fighting in American wars. After the Revolutionary War, African Americans are going to fight in segregated units all the way through World War II. They will not fight side by side with white soldiers until the Korean War in the early 1950s.
One other last thing I want to mention for this episode is integrated units, or at least tactics of utilizing non-white soldiers. This is different from the Civil War, where you do see all-black regiments like James and I talked about in our series on the Civil War. The abolitionist movement hasn't really turned up the way in the 18th century it will in the 19th century. There are Quakers and other groups, but if there are groups utilizing non-white soldiers, it's for much more pragmatic, less ideological, pure motives. James mentioned earlier that the British offered emancipation to slaves who fought for them. But again, it's not for high-minded ideals, and it doesn't turn out in the way that the British thought that they would. There is the far-reaching Phillipsburg Proclamation by Henry Clinton on June 30th, 1779, and Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, issued a similar proclamation in Virginia in 1775, in which freedom is offered to all slaves in return for serving in the British or Tory forces. And Clinton's proclamation goes further than Dunmore's proclamation. It reads, "It must strictly forbid any person to sell or claim right over any Negro, the property of a rebel, who may take refuge with any part of the British army." Clinton also promised, quote, "to every Negro who shall desert the rebel standard, full security to follow within these lines in any occupation which he shall think proper." That sounds pretty good. Once a slave reaches British lines, then his status as property ends, and he's free to do whatever he pleases. But the proclamation also stated, "Any Negroes taken in arms or upon any military duty shall be purchased for a stated price." So this implies that any black man fighting for the Patriots could be reduced to slavery and sold in the West Indies. And slavery is terrible in the colonies, don't get me wrong, but it is much worse in the West Indies. Sugar plantations are, well, let me say the Haitian Revolution makes a heck of a lot of sense, because for those slaves in Haiti, they have so little to lose because conditions are barbaric, and that could give you pause there. So that I want to caution notions of British high-mindedness for there. I think it's purely Machiavellian for this emancipation that they're offering. So the effect of this is that there are a huge number of slaves that do run away from their plantations to British lines, to both Tory and Patriot. And the British, in fact, returned some to their masters, because over 5,000 fled to British lines at Savannah in South Carolina. This stretches British supply lines to the limit, and you have people who don't have military experience and don't have training. A few do fight for the British. They're mostly young men without families or other ties to the plantation. But slaves with wives and children aren't willing to escape alone because they don't want to abandon their families. And the entire family units aren't accepted in the way that a single fighting man would be accepted. But nevertheless, in 1780, when British troops captured Charleston, South Carolina, thousands of slaves joined them. And this happens again in 1781, with many being freed by Benedict Arnold, who is commanding the British expedition. But many of the ex-slaves proved to be a burden because Cornwallis found it difficult to feed them or treat smallpox that ravaged their ranks. So the proclamation did cause dislocation and upset the colonial economy. It, in the end, didn't have much of an impact over who'd win the war. So any other input on that, James, on this emancipation offered?
No, I think you summed it up real well.
All right, well, that is battle number 7, and we're going to trek along. In the next episode, we're jumping right into battle number 8. We're going to look at Kings Mountain. We'll see you there. Okay, so that is all for today. That's today's episode. Thank you for joining me. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our spy masters, Bill Ivey, Joyce Normant, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Baron Fraza, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books, Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is, you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.